We begin this evening with politics, Chinese politics. This morning, it was announced that Bo Xilai, the Communist Party chief in the city of Chongqing, has been removed from his post. Until recently, he had been seen as a front-runner for the Politburo Standing Committee, the highest authority in China. The news comes one day after Prime Minister Wen Jiabao used a press conference to publicly rebuke Bo for a scandal involving the police chief in his city. This major shakeup in the Chinese Party's communist top ranks comes as the party prepares to choose new leadership this fall. Joining me now from Washington, Richard McGregor of the Financial Times. He is the author of The Party, The Secret World of Chinese Communist Rulers, and Damien Ma, China analyst at Eurasia Group. He also writes for The Atlantic magazine. I am pleased to have both of them here to talk about this. I began with Richard. What's going on?
Well, good question. It's a political earthquake, whichever way you look at it in China. I think perhaps the biggest upheaval at the top in the Politburo, arguably since 1989, and that's big because that's when the party almost came asunder. One of the cardinal governing principles of China since 1989 was that there should be no visible splits at the top. And that's been rent asunder with this scandal. And I think there's a couple of things have happened. Number one, you know, Mr. Bo Xilai is a very charismatic politician, in some ways the only true Western-style politician in China, and he's been campaigning very visibly and until recently quite successfully to be elevated, as you said, to the Politburo Standing Committee, you know, the ultimate power center in China. But in early February, his police chief, with whom he had, you know, a very tight bond in Chongqing, fled to the US consulate in Chengdu, tried to defect or tried to tell the US about Mr. Bo Xilai's misdeeds. He eventually gave himself up. And I think that was just for the top Chinese leadership, for a split in the ranks to be played out in the US consulate of all places, was just the worst thing that could happen to Bo Xilai. And I think it's given his enemies, and there are lots of them, plenty of ammunition to bring him down, and that's what he's done. That's what they've done. Now, we don't know whether this is the end of it, whether he'll be later arrested for corruption, but I would say his political career is over.
Damien?
Yeah, Richard, I agree with most of what you had just said. I think to put a little bit of historical context here, let's remember that, you know, many of the top leaders actually don't particularly like Bo Xilai as a politician, precisely, I think, because of what Richard said about his Western-style charisma. That rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, and I think he was, in some sense, banished out to Chongqing, all the way from Beijing, where he was a commerce minister. So I think he tried to make a name for himself, doing all these red songs, Maoist, cultural revolutionary shenanigans that really, I think, disturbed the top leadership at some point. And Wang Lijun, the police chief, when he defected, that was the key opportunity to go after Bo Xilai himself.
How was he a Western politician? What was it that made him so popular at one time?
Yeah, let me give you a few examples. I mean, he's flashy. Most Chinese leaders aren't flashy, and they're the opposite of that. He has these matinee idol good looks, which he makes great use of. He also has, and this is very important, terrific pedigree, Chinese political pedigree. His father is Bo was one of the great 8 immortals of the revolution. So that gave him great status as well. Now, being a princeling is a bit of swings and roundabouts, right? You know, sometimes it can be swung against you, sometimes swing in your favor. At the moment, the princelings have been consolidating power in China, and maybe Bo Xilai's problem is that he was so high profile, so campaigning, that he threatened to upset that. And I think, you know, it's a very important thing in China. You know, if you embarrass the system will gobble you up. And I think with the incident in the US consulate in in Chengdu, you know, it's the system, the empire striking back, and that's what's happened.
And what's happened to the police chief?
The police chief has been officially stripped of his mayor position. They actually sent someone else from the city of Qingdao to replace him. That was announced this morning as well. So his future fate is still very unclear. I think it depends on how much he dished out to the U.S. consulate, how much the Americans know, and how much he dished out to the Central Disciplinary Committee that had him holed up in an office for interrogations. So I think he had nothing to lose. Well, we had heard through the grapevine that he felt his life was being threatened, and that's why he went on the run. this really had the making of a bit of a Hollywood movie, you know, feel to it as well.
I'm holding up the Financial Times, your newspaper, Richard, and there is on the front cover of today's edition, Wen raises fears over return of the Cultural Revolution. Outgoing Premier urges political reform, swipe at Chongqing leader Bo Xilai. And here is the first paragraph that came from Beijing. Chinese leader Wen Jiabao firing a parting shot at conservative officials in the ruling Communist Party. Conservative officials in the ruling Communist Party warning that China could face another cultural revolution unless it undertook urgent political reforms. This is the #2 person in China today, warning that there could be a cultural revolution with all of its horror unless they reformed.
That's right. It's a very sort of, you know, hot phrase for Wen Jiabao to use. And I think he was directly, as the story said, having a slap at Bo Xilai because, as Damien mentioned, Bo Xilai had started this kind of Maoist revival, Maoist nostalgia in Chongqing. And many people do feel nostalgic about Mao because that, in theory, besides the political campaigns, was a time of much more sort of fairness, if you like, without such the rich-poor gap. And many officials, top officials, didn't like it, but they had trouble campaigning against it. How do you campaign or put down somebody who's praising Mao? And that's why this particular incident in Chengdu allowed them to fight back. Now, you've shown yesterday's paper. Here's today's paper. I'll just hold it up for you. Which is out in Asia already, and it'll be out in the States overnight, about Bo Xilai going down. You know, I don't think Wen Jiabao, in talking about the Cultural Revolution, was talking about something like the Cultural Revolution in the 60s and 70s. I think he was talking about the party losing power, because that's what happened in the Cultural Revolution. You know, Mao used the people to overthrow the party. Anarchy. You know, the Communist Party's definition of anarchy is the Communist Party losing power, and I think that's what he was talking about, as well as having a slap at Bo Xilai.
Continue about Wen Jiabao, and this is what I want to get at, the broader question of what's going on in the body politic of China. There's a 3-hour press conference, he said, and quote, he says, there are obviously some political conflicts, with the most important conflicts related to the distribution of power within the party.
Wen Jiabao is not calling for democratic elections, but you know, on the Chinese sort of political ledger, he's on the liberal side of it, and I think it was his last press conference. It's an annual press conference, a very important event, and this was a bit of a bittersweet valediction from him, really, if you like. You know, saying he still stood for these values. He wanted to be going out associated with reform, not for the clock swinging back to Maoist campaigns. But as it turns out, Wen was speaking not just for himself. By putting down Bo Xilai as he did at that press conference, he was giving us a big clue about what happened a day later.
So what do we expect from the new leadership, the vice president who was just here and soon to become president? Damien?
Well, I think Xi Jinping is really not going to show many of his cards right away. I think it takes really 2 to 3 years, if not longer, to consolidate his power. That's how the political system process goes in China. And he may not even get the full military position until Hu Jintao steps down. That's generally how it happened in the last round. So he's, I think, basically on the domestic front going to keep with the current sort of, you know, relative slowdown of the economy and trying to rebalance and spur consumption. I think the biggest uncertainty, the biggest unknown is what are his true foreign policy views. I think China for the last 30, 35 years has had a pretty, you know, a straightforward economic policy strategy, but I don't think they've really had a very coherent foreign policy. And I think given the scope and the impact of China now, I think it's time for them to really think about how to have a more coherent strategy on the foreign policy side, and I don't think anyone really knows where that's going yet.
In Turkey, there has been a campaign by the government in Turkey to reduce the influence of the military, so-called put them back in the barracks. Where is the military in China's political future?
I think that as an interest group in China, or a political interest group, the military have been much more vocal over the past 5 to 10 years. In some ways, the fact that they've become more professional has made them a little bit more independent, or speak more independently of the party. They're developing an empire unto themselves. There's also the interest group politics that all militaries play out, and they're speaking up to ensure they get a bigger budget. But, you know, they've adopted, they sort of wrap themselves in the flag of patriotism, or many of their generals do. And they have a license to speak out that, you know, people in other ministries, and certainly the foreign ministry, do not. And so I think they appear to be having a much greater influence over foreign policy. And I think that certainly has implications for the future and particularly in the Asia-Pacific.
Do China watchers and people in China assume that Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao will play a political role in the future, even though they will not hold power?
The basic thinking right now is that I think Hu Jintao will remain chair of the Central Military Commission, which is the top post in the military, probably for another term after he formally steps down as the top leader in the Communist Party. So I think that's why I made my point earlier about you know, Vice President Xi Jinping, even when he gets to the presidency, he may have some time to consolidate his power among the military interests.
Richard?
Yeah, and I think also, yeah, Hu Jintao, for example, is the nominal head of one of the two big factions, you know, the China Youth League faction. His influence will live on. His people are, littered through the Politburo, so I think he's an important figure. Wen Jiabao less so. He's not a factional figure. I don't think he's well networked. He's cut a much more independent path, you know, which hasn't garnered him much power. So, of the two departing leaders, I think Hu will be more powerful and Wen and his family a little bit more vulnerable.
Does Hu tends to be, in terms of some right-left of the right, does he not? Less reformist and more conservative and traditional?
It's a little bit like that, but as somebody once described it to me, you know, you look at Hu Jintao from a distance walking, it's like a duck, you know, 1 minute the right foot forward, the next minute the left foot forward, and you can't really tell. So I don't think we can, you know, the right-left labels are great, but I tell you, he's very conservative on the issue of maintaining the party's power. That's in his lifeblood. They all are, but I think him particularly so. He's really a creature of the party bureaucracy. And getting back to our original point, the demise of Bo Xilai, I think, is the triumph of party bureaucracy and discipline over sort of campaigning and charisma. And for Hu Jintao, it's a big victory.
Richard McGregor, Financial Times, thank you so much. Damien Ma, Eurasia Group and The Atlantic. Back in a moment. Stay with us.